if you were to walk along a mountain road and you saw somebody on the side of the road with a boulder on their chest. Empathy is walking up and saying, oh my gosh, that boulder must be so heavy. It must really be crushing your ribs. It's probably hard for you to breathe right now. And I can imagine you're thinking you're not sure how to get out of this situation. That's empathy. Walking up and pushing the boulder off the chest, that's compassion.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season includes 25 incredible episodes devoted to the inner development goals. Based on the science of personal transformation, the IDG framework represents 23 skills needed for today's world. And of course, empathy is one of them. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by Carson Kelly, a serial entrepreneur who is committed to scaling compassion. He is the founder and director of Compassion 2.0, an organization committed to bringing compassionate architecture that is scientifically validated and measurable to organizational and product design. He also co-founded a platform for acts of altruism and another that promotes self-compassion and empathy. I've invited Carson to join this special IDG series because his work exemplifies the empathy and compassion trait within the Inner Development Goals framework. And I want to welcome Carson to the show.
Thank you for having me, Anita. It's good to be here.
Super. So we just had like a delicious back chat before I hit record. I'm so excited for this conversation, and those who are listening or watching, you're in for a real treat, I am sure. I always love to hear people's backstories, so I went onto your website. So it's www.compassion2.com, and it read, and I think it's worth sharing. We scale compassionate human experiences and frameworks of flourishing through product and organizational cultural design that is rooted in science. Okay, that's a big statement that what you're up to, right? I want to know what led you here. So what's the backstory to how you got to the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's see here. Well, I'll go way back, might as well. When I was in high school, I had an experience on a river rafting trip where I was confronted with my own mortality. Just very simply, I had an experience where I started to drown. And I knew at that moment in time, there was a choice to either not drown or to release the body, so to speak, and to transition somewhere else. Where that was, what that meant, how that all unfolded, I can't really give you any further answers, but it wasn't kind of a posteriori, so to speak, experience, empirical experience of knowing that I could release the body. So that was a big deal at 17 years old. And when I got through that, it took me a while to process that and understand that. But as the synchronicity also happens, I had a new English teacher at the turn of the term and turned me on to Taoism and Zen Buddhism and a number of Eastern philosophical traditions. So I had been recruited to go down to the USC School of Film to do film production, but had this experience and changed my heart and my focus. Got there, started studying Eastern philosophy, realized I didn't want to do it in school. Transferred from USC up to the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I also transferred and started studying Western philosophy. But I'd also been working in New Age bookstores the entire time to kind of feed my desire to learn more about, alternative ways of being or experiencing the universe, so to speak. So fast forward, thought I was going to become a philosophy professor, realized I didn't want to do that, became a book publisher in the topics of New Age, for lack of a better term, and did that for a number of years. High tech explosion happened in Silicon Valley, where I'm located. I got recruited to go to a startup. We bootstrapped that for a number of years. And then I made my way into enterprise software for a number of years, kind of all the while still studying and having my passion interests on the side, so to speak. And then Right around 2018, two things happened. One of which was a dear friend of mine who was in the social venture space. So he set up the first organic beer company in the United States. He had set up two of Paul Newman's summer camps for kids that are chronically and terminally ill and had just done an incredible amount of work. He had been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at 52 years old. So his career came to a stop. And the project that we wanted to do one day became the project we needed to do right away. So that was happening. And then shortly after that started to happen, I traveled with my wife, who teaches at a small private school that's located at an intentional yogic community and conference center, and also has a K through 12 school. And she went to this school and, as I said, teaches at the school. And her class that she teaches is seniors, so 12th graders. And they had been invited by the Dalai Lama on fifth time to his private residence in Dharamshala to talk to him about the nature of secular ethics and the environment. And so I had the opportunity to go on that trip, and I just very briefly met him. And he teased me for looking old, which was amazing. So I had this 10-second experience with him, but just being in India, which I hadn't done before, and being in his presence and so on. Those two events of my friend getting ill and needing to do a project, and then spending time in India and having the incredible good fortune to meet His Holiness. I came back and left my software focus and set up a company called Benevolently, which was a platform for acts of altruism. And then that led, COVID happened. We put that in the garage. That led to me founding another company, also in the space of the neuroscience and compassion, and scaling that there's a practice that we were working to scale. And then that led to me setting up Compassion 2.0.
Wow. Wow. See, I love that question. No wonder. I mean, that's such a cool journey. And I want to unpack so much there, remembering that we have a lot to cover today. At 17 years old, that experience, just as a quick follow-up question, although maybe it won't be a quick answer, were you anywhere close to being in the frame of mind of all these orientations that you eventually discovered and pursued and were attracted to? So like an identity, that's so, I just want to understand a little bit, because it's rare to come across somebody who's had a near-death experience so how did you integrate that? I would love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And it's funny, actually, this question came up for me maybe a month ago from someone, and I had never been asked this question before, and I'd never thought about it explicitly. When I reflect back at that time, I was mostly reacting to the experience. It wasn't that I had this grand understanding in the sense of, oh, our embodiment's temporary. Oh, there's, more of these things outside of somatically experiencing it, feeling it, seeing it, understanding that I had a very tangible handle on the fact, for me, at least that I experienced, that I could release my body almost like I had a grip on it from my chest, like here, I could just let it go. And I knew that the muscular skeletal meat sack, so to speak, would continue to tumble down the river. And I, whatever that was, would transition through a veil that had been presented. And I kind of went through it a little bit, but I had a sense of there would be a persistence of awareness. There would be whatever that is, whatever in that moment. And I'm sure there are many masters on this planet that could explain this, or, I don't know, correct my understanding in some way. But based on what I understood then and continue to understand now, I had a very clear understanding that it's not lights out when it comes time for the passage or the release of the body. So that's not something that I could just kind of walk away from, so to speak. It was something that I necessarily had to go and find answers. Not to say that I have, but just spending the time to explore and understand that everything that had been taught to me in Marin County, California, where I'd grown up, which is, an affluent area and so forth, and there's certain values and things are taught to kids, and just like there are everywhere in the world, different contexts, et cetera. But in Marin County, it was a certain set. And I realized that wasn't going to lead very far, in the sense of, if I spent my time pursuing those things, that certain things might be more comfortable in life in the short term, but it wouldn't answer the bigger questions.
Well,
So it took me a long time.
I love the fact that, I mean, there's probably so much to unpack in terms of what that experience was and that knowledge that you can't unknow now has meant for your life, but that it's probably net a positive experience and has inspired quite a lot of interesting searching. And I love the fact that you didn't just ignore it. I love the fact that your life is infused by wanting to share what you learn and wanting to grow the community of people who are seeking answers to these big questions. So thank you, thank you, thank you for the work that you're doing and knowing that it's coming from such a cool origin story. Like, anyways, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So back to your website for a second. I caught another thing that I want to read out. And then, you can answer a question, because it's essentially a question about the business case for compassion, which is interesting. The website says there's a myth out there that compassion is a soft skill, and that from an organizational perspective, it's a nice to have concept. I even hear that too when I do my training, like, we're a high performance organization. Sounds really good on paper, but like blah, blah. And then you say, or the website says, the thinking goes that in times of great difficulty, from a business perspective, that these soft skills and these investments needed to create them are unnecessary. Furthermore, the company has to buckle down and discard the frameworks in order to get the real business done. Nothing could be further from today's truth, the website says. Compassion requires a basis of great strength and resilience in order for it to be present between people, and modern organizations need to create the space for this strength to unfold. I love that. You're, of course, speaking to the converted on this, but let's make the case. Let's make the case. Why do we need to do this? Why is it not a soft skill?
The world is, in our sense of it, extraordinarily extractive. And extractive-based frameworks, which exist everywhere, drive, in the case of business specifically, drive transactional results. That's what they're for. And the idea is that you measure the success of a business through its transactional results of an ROI, return on investment. Namely, I'm an investor. I put money into this entity to try to make something happen, create value in the process, of course. But the value is to have the money come back. A few things come up around that. First of which is, at what point is enough money enough? At what point do we move from scarcity, from that sort of mindset, into its antidote, which is blind accumulation, to the point where we have so much, but we continue to seek it, that we lose sight of the fact that we're embodied. And our embodiment, speaking to the first part of this conversation, will come to an end. And between now and that point, there's a certain number of heartbeats. We don't know how many we have. We might be running out of the last few of them this afternoon. Who knows? Maybe we have another 50 years. Who knows? It doesn't matter. But it's the time element of when the heart is beating and the experience of the relationships or the self-resonance or whatever it might be is where the wealth is. That's where wealth ultimately is. And it's true, money, of course, by all means is necessary. It can be very helpful for people. It can be given away. It can provide security. It can provide all of the things that every single human being on the planet would like to have. But those things that people are desiring are safety. And safety is when we move from a place of threat response, namely being triggered in the amygdala, and we're assessing our environment for threat, and we fight or we flight or we freeze. Okay, so this is kind of a part of the thread. The other part of the thread is that transactional based organizations completely is in denial of the fact that organizations aren't just a compilation of functions, and ultimately of people being the function, not people in the function, people being the function. which is a misrepresentation of an organization to begin with, because it's only focused on transactional value. And then there's this extractive relationship between the organization and the persons that are in the company performing the jobs or the roles. And that's extractive. So, and there's a dance there too of basically the organization is saying, in order to optimize for greater return for my investors, how do I get this person to do this thing and give them as little as I can get away with ultimately? Ultimately, there's that level of negotiation. So there's this chain of extraction, so to speak. The reality of that is when you're in an extractive or transactionally based organization, particularly ones that are utilizing threat or implications of threat, people don't operate necessarily from their best selves, so to speak, or in relationship to others. They operate in response to threat. So they're necessarily operating from a place of fear or anger in some way. Usually anger is a result of fear. Usually it's fear first. So when an organization is wanting to look at its people to say, how do we get the best result for the organization? Do you want all of your best and your brightest to be running around in spaces of fear and or anger because they're operating from the amygdala? Or do you want them to operate from a place of rest and digest, a place of safety, where they're no longer scanning the environments for threats? Their inhibitions in terms of what we call resonance to self and resonance to other. In a threat environment, it shuts down to oneself, and it shuts down to relationship to other. In a safety environment, the resonance increases and the expansion occurs. In the relationships to other, also the expansion occurs. There's trust, there's harmony. In the former, there's distrust, there's lack of transparency. There's potential intentional harm in order to protect oneself. It's just simple. And from what I understand from the neurobiologists and neuroscientists and all of the other people that I've had the good fortune to talk to, this is pretty much proven. So if you're an organization, why on earth wouldn't you want to have your people operating in the best possible framework so that they can ideate? This is what Google started to understand with Google's Project Aristotle, which I'm familiar. I know you probably are, but for those that are listening that might not be, they should definitely just take a look, check it out. So for us, the business case is simple. It's very simple. If you want the best out of your folks, create an environment of safety, have generosity, move them out of fear so that they can ideate and perform. Because at the end of the day, that's all that the people want to do, is they want to be in harmonious relationship, producing something amazing. It's not hard. So anything counter to that, this notion that, hard skills or transactional skills, well, technically, I just learned this, soft skills was a phrase that came from the United States Army that had to do with all skills in the Army that didn't touch metal, from what I understand. And maybe that's not right, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Hard skills were the ones where people were touching airplanes and tanks and that sort of thing. So even the term, the soft skills is a misnomer to begin with. It's all ridiculous. If you want to get hardcore, then go figure out how to make spaces of safety for your people, because it also requires a certain level of self-resonance to be able to create that for others. And that's very hard too. Anyway, I could go on and on about this, but I'll put it.
Well, so you will go on, because I'm going to ask you the question about the ROI of Care project, which I think is really sort of a gateway to the next step of this conversation. So, borrowing again from the words on your website, the ROI of Care project, designed to demonstrate the tangible benefits of cultivating care-based cultures and organizations. By integrating compassionate practices, businesses can unlock new levels of productivity, innovation, and profitability. So that's what you just talked about. But what does that really mean? Like, how do you do that? What's the training? What's the way to unlock all of this?
Well, we have a thesis that the ROI of care is basically looking at, to your point in my previous answer, looking at when care is infused into an organization and you move from evaluating its performance from just ROI and you add on the added dimension of care, there's an explosive, result. We think that in the premise of our work, that there's a transactional element, or I shouldn't say, excuse me, there's a transactional result from an organization's culture and its design as an organization, that is exclusive of the human relational field that exists in organizations at all times, period. It's just ROI based measurement doesn't acknowledge it per se. It thinks about the humans in the organization again as the functions, not humans in the functions per se. And these are broad overgeneralizations I'm making. I totally understand that. There's amazing organizations out there that don't do this by all means, but generally speaking. So within the organization, as it goes through time and it's performing, and maybe it's rising and falling, its performance is up and down, market conditions, COVID, new tech advances in a given market, whatever, things happen. As it's going up and down, instead of just looking at the performance of how much financial value it kicks out to the investors, there's a human field, a human relational field that's tracking with that organization's ups and downs. So the ROI of care is looking at that field and trying to understand how to measure it, because the field exists because people work together. It's just we haven't been sophisticated enough yet to acknowledge it and then start to measure it. So the ROI of care is an effort that we're doing with industry practitioners, also with behavioral scientists, and we're going to loop in some behavioral economists and some neuroscientists and so forth. And we are in the process, we're just beginning this, to put actual tangible measurements into all of that human field frame that I just described, to have it ladder up into a series of algorithms to understand the actual financial value. So here's an example. Getting back to the Project Aristotle example. At Google, they looked at 175 of their top performing teams, and they found that there were 5 elements that made them tick, and one of which was by far accounted for most of the result, which is psychological safety. Again, people felt safe. So when people feel safe, what happens is that they have better harmonious relationships. They, like I said, they move from an inhibition to an expansive state, and they start to ideate. And they know that if they put an idea out into their team that's not very good, the team's not going to pile on or harm them or create some sort of negative repercussions. So, and I'm only speculating here because I don't know the specifics. I didn't work at Google or what have you, but just from what I've read and anecdotally talked to people. So what happens is practically, so you're working on one of these teams at Google doing, let's say you're a software developer or a product person or what have you, and you can come in and you can say, over the weekend to your team, over the weekend, I was walking my dog and I had this idea about if we change this little function here and we could monetize it as part of that package over there, or add it on as another $1 per user per month. What do you guys think? It might be just crazy. And people can say, oh, that's amazing. Let's do it. Let's pilot it. Let's check it out. Or they might say, no, it's not so good. But regardless, there will be enough of these ideas that do get put on the table because people feel safe, that then it's actioned and turned into money. So in the case of Google, you have, a bazillion users who are now using something for $1 a month, and just do the math. And that wouldn't have happened unless the person felt safe to put the idea in the mix. It's that simple. It's simple. So we want to understand, how does the ROI of care show up in sales? How does it show up in marketing, product development, operations, supply chain relationships, distribution, whatever the business model is of a given organization? Where does this ideation and this expansive resonance how we define it, show up and turn into tangible value in the transactional part of the organization as a result? And that's where the human field turns into transactions. And we think that relationship between transactions and the human field, we actually think it's a metabolic based analysis. It's a living organism based frame, but we're just exploring these ideas. So I can't tell you much more than that.
I totally buy that because I'm so attracted to biomimicry. I'm so attracted to living systems as, models to look at for human patterns. And yeah, that's great. Actually, I would clue you in on working with horses. I've learned that horses are one of the most attuned animal because they're animals of prey, not animals. Yeah, so they don't go out and hunt other animals. They're usually preyed upon. So they're very attuned. And also because they work in herds, and there's always like an alpha the alpha male's job is to ensure the collective flourishing, which is a word I know you care deeply about, that all of the work has to do with the collective flourishing. And so anyways, I'm fascinated by this research, and I'm excited for you to put, some early results out so that we can all learn from it. And yeah, okay, great. Yes, super. Carson, super. So I want to talk then, okay, you've mentioned this extraction thing, right? So you write also on your website about this philosophical paradigmic shift that needs to happen from extraction to generation. And I'm hearing a lot of regenerative finance, regenerative agriculture, generation, regeneration, generation, regeneration. Very exciting. I want to hear what you have to say in general about that, in addition to what you've already shared. But I also want to know if it's leaning towards, the example you used about how we can monetize that $1 times a billion users, and you do the math. Like that clearly does sound appealing to an organization. If we can create some psychological safety, they'll innovate, we'll have better business results. But like the earlier comment you made about like this business results at like to what end? The accumulation of wealth to what end when we are all like impermanent? I wonder if this shift, extraction to generation, also speaks to a more systemic
Oh, yeah,
shift.
absolutely.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Tell
Yeah,
us.
absolutely. So, first off, I really dig what you said about the horses. And yes, we are fully grounding our work into the natural world systems. Like the trees and the mycelium and all the stuff. Like it is unbelievable. So to your implied point, the best teacher is the thing that's been doing this for how many years? And you can just go and learn from it and try to replicate it. Like, why wouldn't you? Anyway, totally with you on that. We can nerd out on that another time. The extractive to generative framing. This is something that's come up for me in the past, maybe 6 months, something of that nature. And to be clear, and you didn't, not that you said this, but for the audience who are might be confused, I don't think about it as regenerative. I think about it as generative versus extractive. And there's been some influences on this for me about this, but I've had a personal shift. And I think that as above, so below, so to speak, right? So the whatever is in the micro, namely our orientation towards the world, then ladders up and is reflected in the macro, namely our organizations, our political body, whatever it might be, how we do things as groups. In an extractive worldview, I'm going to go a tiny bit meta. It's based on a hyper-rational subject-object dualistic framework, namely that we're these subjective beings, that we have these great subjective experiences, and the world is largely an object for our consumption at some level, basically. It's not the case everywhere, but generally speaking. And when you combine that with scarcity, which is what we've been coming from for how many thousands of generations or what have you, we orient towards extracting from the world for our accumulative experience or our best interest generally. So organizations, for instance, even just looking at the language, particularly post-industrial age, look at the earth as resources, trees, fish, the air, whatever it might, minerals under the ground, whatever it is, it's extracted and utilized in some capacity for some other value, which is fine. Okay, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Humans are also considered resources, namely human resources, where we are extracting from them their time and their labor for organizational result. Now, unfortunately, with the advent of social media and some of this other, later tech elements to our world, we're now extracting attention from people. And when we look at the result of this extractive frame, what do we have to show for it? Well, we have a depleted environmental system that is continuing to deplete. And there's a lot of amazing work out there. People are doing great work to try to restore or regenerate what's happened, which is great. But we have people, broadly speaking, who are so over extracted that the anger is now bubbling up to the point where a person was killed in the street because he ran a health insurance company here in the United States. The extraction is so extreme, it continues to grow. On top of that, not just the anger and the division, but there's also loneliness and depression and isolation, and all of those metrics are off the charts, and they're just growing. It's getting worse. And there's a multiple range of reasons, there's no question. And I know these things are very complicated, and people much smarter than me have a better handle on it. But just in the sense of looking at what I'm observing, there's this great extraction. And here in the United States, unfortunately, when you look at that extractive result, it translates into capital. And the capital has been accumulated to the point where 1% in the United States of the folks have, from what I understand, 50% of the accumulated wealth in this country. That's not right. That's out of balance. It's okay to make money. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but it's not okay to have it extremes to the point where the broad populace is in constant amygdala response because they don't know their food prices are going up, other opportunities are becoming less, their organizations that they work for aren't necessarily being supportive. There aren't many care-based systems or care-based places in the United States in particular. Unfortunately, church attendance is dropping and continues to drop. But there isn't really anything that's replaced it per se. Something that provides that nourishment for your spiritual life, your communal life, knowing that if you fall on a hard time, someone can come in and support you. Now, of course, people have friends, et cetera. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but I'm talking about broad meta patterns. And so then the question becomes is, what have we done with all this extractive capital, and how are we going to continue down this path? Because there's nothing much left, arguably, to continue to extract from. And I think, again, it's tied to a scarcity frame, and it's over indexing on trying to accumulate to offset the fear driven by scarcity. And it's like a hungry ghost. It's just out of hand. The inverse to this is being generative. So instead of showing up in the world and looking at the world and seeing something to take from it, to consume or to accumulate, the inverse is true, where you show up and say, how do I originate value? Like if you drop a rock in a still pond and those ripples go out, how do I say this not rhetorically, it's for myself. I try to ask myself these questions, and I have some success, but I have a lot more room to grow. But how do I show up and just give value to help others? Because there's plenty in this world for us to deal with our foodstuffs and our security and housing and all of the things. We have the ability to provide, but our mindsets are the things that are preventing us from having that actually equitably made available. So being in a generative frame is, for me at least, tied to deep gratitude for what I have, in terms of I'm an incredibly privileged person. I mean, incredibly privileged. Growing up in Marin, looking like I do, like I fully recognize that, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. And from that place, I try to show up and to give. Now, it's not, it's not that extraction or generative framing is just necessary, or just an economic looking at the world, or a resources distribution looking at the world. Ultimately, for me, and again, being a little meta, it's about our own spiritual orientation, which comes back to, how do we show up to ourselves? Are we fearful and we're worried about what's going to come after we're gone, which is a very healthy and normal thing to be concerned about? Or in spite of those concerns, can we reorient and be generative? Because I think at the end of the day, at least for me, not to say that I'm doing this for self-benefit, but when you do drop the rock and it hits, those waves ripple outward, eventually it'll arguably hit a shore and bounce back. So it becomes a question of how we orientate ourselves. Are we trying to grasp, or are we trying to provide or be giving? I don't know if that makes sense, but
Totally makes sense. And I want to share a story. I don't typically talk on my own podcast, but it's so recent and salient. And I want to preface the story by saying it's not, I'm the protagonist in this story. But if this story was not about me, I'd want to share it as much. So it's not about me, it's about this, the value of the story, because it's so in line with what you shared. So I was at a Vipassana retreat for the first time. I got back yesterday. 10 days of silence where you don't even make eye contact with the people that you're dining with and sitting across and walking on, the outdoors with, like none of it. So it was intense on so many levels, and you're sitting for 1 hour, 3 times a day, trying not to move and observe the sensations on your body and to try to make peace with a good sensation or a negative one and try to reach a state of what they call equanimity so that the lessons that you take from that experience you can bring out into your real life and not have respond in triggering ways or, just have more peace in how you go about the world. I mean, that's the practice. And there's so much more to say and yada, yada. Okay, but that's the frame. The very last day, we are invited to do a different type of meditation, which is metta, the Sanskrit word, I think, for loving kindness. And there was a moment, it happened a few times where in these meditation sessions, my hands, it didn't go much past my sort of like mid arm, but my hands started to feel like I couldn't tell where the outline of my fingers ended, even though my memory knew, because I've seen my hands, and if all I needed to do was move them and then I would feel them again. But in that moment, the physical sensation was that I didn't know where my fingers and hands ended and where the rest of the world was. Like I was kind of like, those hands were one with something. Okay. That was cool, I have to say. And the meta meditation on the heels of, a week of this or 10 days of this was for us to just completely send any form of peace that you felt yourself to send out to the people in the room and the people in the world. Okay. And it was the only time in 10 days that I stayed longer than the hour. Okay. We did the meta meditation and it came to an end. I could see people leaving, or I could hear people because I was quiet and my eyes were closed. And I must have stayed 10 or 15 minutes longer, just really savoring the feeling. Okay. And when I finally made the decision, okay, time to go, just before getting up, I heard a woman a few rows down weeping, and she caught my attention. And it wasn't like a hard cry. I don't know what the cry was about, but she was just weeping. And one of the practices of the meditation is you don't touch anybody. You don't look at each other. You don't touch anybody. And all day long, every time I was in the meditation hall, I had a shawl that was given to me like 20 years ago from India, a beautiful cashmere shawl that's warm and stunning. And I don't know where the volition came from, but I just dropped the shawl on her shoulders and walked away. And there was a period, I went through a variety of after effects from that gesture where initially it was like, how am I going to ask for the shawl back? Because it means so much to me. And then it moved to, what if I just compliment her on the shawl and she says, are you the one who gave it to me? And I was kind of going through these iterations until finally I realized it's her shawl. It's not my shawl. It's her shawl now. And I don't want to even bring to her attention that I'm the one who did it, because the shawl will matter so much to her that she doesn't need to have a person who gave it to her. And my ego does not need the thank you. And it felt so pure. Like I got goosebumps talking about it. It felt so pure to do this and then just let it go. So I feel like that's what you're describing, this
Exactly what I'm describing. And the generative framing it's been largely inspirational for me from Tibetan Buddhist practices and other Dharma practices. It's because that's a fundamental element, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, as I understand it, is this deep care for other as a way to help others. And yes, that's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing. And it's interesting to see the mind be attached to things that way, right? And for you, you gave her this thing that you were attached to, and now she has it, and that's the end of the discussion. And you have this, how to say, I can't speak for you, but I can imagine there's now a reservoir, or there's a certain filling that you have probably in your experience that you can carry forward. Not that you need to be attached to that, but it's tapping into a source of some sort. But that story is exactly what I mean about being generative.
And
There,
what I've discovered is I don't go in my head and I'm like, oh God, I'm so generous. Like, look at me
no,
doing
I
that.
understand.
What I really
I
feel
understand that.
is what a gift she gave me to
Right.
let me gift her this thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Totally. It's not about you, and totally. It's the invitation. And that's the other thing too that we really understand about, or starting to understand about, being generative and frame. It's all invitational.
Mm.
And gratitude is deeply in there. And just to your beautifully said, the opportunities she gave you in order to move past your own attachments. I mean,
Yeah.
exactly right. It's not about anything else. So beautiful.
Ah, cool. All right. That was fun. That was fun to share. Thank you. I'm so glad I shared it with you because you seem to really get what I'm talking about, which is great. Okay. You also have the Chief Flourishing Officer Learning Journey,
Mhm.
right? Humans that flourish create organizations that flourish. So let's talk about that. What's that about?
So, my personal mission for my professional career, the reigning of my professional career, is to scale compassion, like you mentioned at the very beginning of this recording. And the goal is to touch the people that can touch the many people, so to speak. So, we want to create frames of generative experience for as many people as we can through organizational culture, and we see that there's a business case to do so. It just makes sense financially, ultimately. Um, So the chief flourishing officer is either in name or in function, either full time or part time, like a fractional version of it, is a person that understands two things. They understand scientifically validated or deeply inspired products, interventions, and services that they then know how to deploy to create what we call resonance in individuals that work in the organization, as well as organizational resonance. So again, resonance broadly inside an organization is the result of individuals' resonance to themselves and resonance to other. And then organizationally, the resonance of itself and its others. So itself is the actual collection of the field of those individuals and their individual resonance collectively. And then its other are the expressions that that organization puts out in what we're calling karmic exhaust. It's kind of a silly concept, but the idea is as an organization goes through time and it's doing some things, it's transacting business and it does it in a certain way. So one might be, mowing down rainforests. Another might be donating socks for everyone that's purchased. But there's an off gas of that activity as a collective organization in relationship to the environment, its communities, other stakeholders, et cetera. So resonance is all of those things. So the chief flourishing officer understands how to deploy these scientifically validated interventions to generate organizational resonance. Additionally, they then understand and can articulate the ROI of care to other business leadership and stakeholders relative to the business value proposition of that particular organization. So if they're a manufacturer or a distributor or a services provider or whatever it might be, the chief flourishing officer is the one that can, again, move the needle on the ROI of care metrics by generating greater resonance and represent both and then manage it.
So does that mean you're only working with organizations that have the potential to be non-extractive? I'm just trying to imagine like a mining company. You can't go in and work with a mining company because if you really are successful, then they no longer want to mine.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I don't have an answer for that one yet. I have to think about that one more. I would say that, I would imagine that part of the answer is it's one of getting back to Buddhist principles of emptiness and perception of emptiness, right? So there was an old saying that said if Southern Pacific Railways knew that they were in the transport business, we would all be flying Southern Pacific Airlines. But right. So there's this thing that where people show up and there's this tyranny of self-definition or self, how to say, closure, so to speak, in terms of what it is that they're doing. So maybe the mining company, maybe they're in the energy business or they're in some sort of business and they can just simply reframe ultimately ways in which to get into other lines of business to utilize their capital as their activity in the mines maybe starts to slow or ultimately stop. And I know that sounds very ideal, and I'm not suggesting otherwise because I know that these are large, in this example, large scale businesses, thousands and thousands of people's livelihoods, et cetera. And so I don't have an immediate answer. That being said, it's not so much too about just an extractive nature of a particular business, but it's also how the business treats its people in whatever it is that they're doing. Because ultimately for us, the concept is that if we can create those fields of generative orientation for the people that are in those organizations, as a result of the organization intentionally creating that for them, we really aren't so much about first and foremost, trying to create organizations that are more successful. What we're actually trying to do is we're trying to change people's lives from fear and extractive framing to generative framing so that when they're in their personal lives as well, they're able to have better, more harmonious relationships with their friends, their families, their community members, all of those things. But the way to get to them is through the organization to do so.
Right.
And the organizations will benefit as a result because we spend, I don't know, I'd be curious to know what the metric is, but how much waking time, not necessarily 24 hours in a day, but time that we're awake, how much of that time is either engaged with or thinking about work for everybody? It's substantial. So anyway, the larger goal here is to change those lives if we can do it in this way. But to your point about the mining, I don't have an answer on that yet.
Right. It might take a few generations before we see the outcome of those system-like changes. Wow. Okay. I love what you're up to, and I've loved this conversation, and I'm sure everybody listening and watching has loved too. I would be remiss on a podcast that's about empathy and the IDG framework talking about compassion and empathy, not to even ask a little bit. So I don't really know what I want to ask specifically, but I want to just open up an aperture to, they have the IDG framework listed as compassion and empathy, or empathy and compassion. I don't know what order it is, doesn't really matter. Do you have anything that you want to say, either from your earlier app or anything about empathy that you want to bring surface, lift up?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that in my trajectory, in terms of who I've talked to and what I've learned and experienced, empathy, the way that we define it is that there's cognitive empathy and affective empathy, and then there's compassion. And sometimes people, and I don't know, I haven't listened to all of your podcasts, so I'm not sure if this has been discussed or not, but just to put it out there for listeners, the way we orientate it, the Dalai Lama, Jeff Weiner, the former CEO of LinkedIn, who set up a colleague and a friend of mine as one of the first mindfulness and compassion. What was his title? The director of mindfulness and compassion at LinkedIn. I'm not entirely sure, but Jeff Weiner, total visionary, told the story when he was addressing a university graduating class, I think at Penn or Wharton. Anyway, and the story is about how the Dalai Lama defined it, which is if you were to walk along a mountain road and you saw somebody on the side of the road with a boulder on their chest, empathy is walking up and saying, oh my gosh, that boulder must be so heavy. It must really be crushing your ribs. It's probably hard for you to breathe right now. And I can imagine you're thinking you're not sure how to get out of this situation. That's empathy. Walking up and pushing the boulder off the chest, that's compassion. So it's in my definition and understanding of it. So it's an act of once we've reached out and we've allowed ourselves to engage with another and understand their feelings and their emotional space, if there's a way in which we can alleviate their suffering for their benefit, just like you did with the shawl, if there's a way to do that for their benefit, that's an act of compassion. So I would just put that out there for consideration again, and that's just one perspective. There's so many different ways to slice and dice this. I have friends who say no, empathy is these other things, and it's totally cool. But this is just how we show up to it in terms of our frame. So I
Wait,
would,
there is like a lot of discourse around, compassion, empathy, not which is better, which do you want to privilege, but there is a sense that some people are in the empathy camp, some people are in the compassion camp. West Coasters tend to be in the compassion camp. They talk about like compassion has an orientation towards action. I think that's why I put a little emphasis on purposeful empathy. So it's empathy for a
totally,
purpose, which is, in line with that. So yeah, I
totally.
just wanted to
Yeah. I would say that the IDGs in particular, getting back to that, are amazing. And I'm glad to see um, that they're taking hold. It seems like people are getting more and more interested. We're going to do just a little shameless plug here. We're going to do a San Francisco Bay Area Interdevelopment Goal Bay Area Summit, pulling together all of the folks that are doing IDG related work in the Bay Area and get into conversation. Um, One of the things that we're ideating about right now is we would love to see in the United States, I'm not going to represent this for other people, but some sort of concept around like a secretary of flourishing at a presidential cabinet level and it being driven off of an IDG based framework and or deeply informed framework of some sort. So along those lines, we're thinking about, well, then how do you get that at the state level or at the city level? So at this summit, we're going to try to engage some of the local politicians and see if we can convince some of them or one of them to try to become a
What a great
clerk.
idea. And Bhutan being a good reference point, right?
Precisely. Bhutan's amazing in terms of that. Yeah.
Yeah, super. Oh, well, good luck with that. When is it?
Thanks. June 11th, 12th, and 13th in the Bay Area.
So if you're listening to this when this comes out in April, I hope you check out the show notes where you can get more information about attending or hearing the outcomes of that. Last question, Carson, and this is thank you for your time. Thank you for the work you're doing. I like to end on a note of a personal note of how empathy has mattered to you. So can you think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end
That's
of
a great question.
empathy and
Mhm.
what that meant for you?
Hmm. Gosh, there's so many different things. The one that keeps coming to my brain, um, I don't know if how one would judge this or not, and in terms of size or scale, so it's not relevant. But there were two people that, as I was transitioning from my more traditional software, enterprise software world that I was in into this other space, this career pivot. One, a venture capitalist in the space who was really one of the leaders in investing in companies for years and years. He gave me a fair amount of his time as I was transitioning from that space and encouragement and set up a series of ongoing conversations with me and just was really supportive as I was grappling and fearful, of course, about, oh, what am I doing? This is nuts. Um, and so I would say that without that encouragement from that caliber of person at that time, I don't know if I would be on this path as well as another person, another colleague who was a former superintendent of well-being at Google, who had done the same for me as well in a different way, but provided time and attention and care and consideration to support me as I, again, made this change into this space. So I would say that those two things, those two folks and those similar acts have been phenomenally supportive and helpful, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Again, it's not a huge thing, but I mean, by, some other measurements, but it has been an important influence for me. So I would say that.
And those words that you just used, that basket of words like time and support and encouragement and care and empathy, all of those got bundled together in the form of this answer. And the reason I love this question, I never know what I'm going to hear as an answer, is it's always a reminder to me, and hopefully people listening and watching, that every person can think of a time when they were on the receiving end of those basket of goodwill. And it's it's really interesting to know that, this might have been 20 minutes or an hour every couple of weeks or whatever number of hours of their life spent, but for you was pivotal in how you made this major shift that your amygdala is firing. What am I doing? As you're trying to gravitate, I think, towards a calling, what sounds to me. And you
Mhm.
felt like you said this man, this person or people of gravitas were giving you that, you know, and the last thing I'll say as an extension to that is we all have the capacity to do that.
Absolutely.
So when I say we can turn up the volume of empathy in our lives, the gifts we can give others through our time and care and encouragement and support and all that is just that's like what we got to do.
Yeah, it's simple. And I think the thing again comes back to me about the shawl experience that you had is that similarly to that experience, it's actually self-serving ultimately, even though it's not about self. But there's serotonin, oxytocin, all the good feelings come forward, insight comes forward, all of these things start to happen. The plasticity in the brain changes. And for me, and I still have to explore this further in terms of how this works, but it continues to like fuel the flames of gratitude, which then in turn create greater empathy. So there's a magical thing that happens in the cauldron, so to speak, of just giving.
So long as, and I think it's an important footnote, you don't expect that.
Totally. Exactly. It's exactly right. Well said. Absolutely. You're not doing it for that end. You're doing it truly to benefit the other, and it brings you joy to see their benefit as a result. And ideally, again, like you did with the shawl, anonymously, without ego.
Carson, so great to spend a whole hour of my day with you. I'm feeling so rock star. I'm meeting a friend. I'm officiating their wedding, and we're going to work on their little thing. And I'm feeling like all the juju of like wanting to
Nice.
make this love and all that stuff. So
Awesome. Awesome.
thank you. And thank you for listening and watching. We'll see you next week at
Yeah.
Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who'd benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Post the link on your socials and hit the subscribe button now. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.